In this webinar, what we're going to do is have a look at walkthrough animations within SolidWorks, some of the techniques you can use to create walkthroughs, and we're also going to have a look at cameras and using them within some of your animations to actually create a bit more advanced animations and actually go around some of the larger assembly models you might have. So what I'm going to do first of all is just switch over into SolidWorks. I've already got this assembly model opened up, and this is an assembly model that I'm going to use first of all for the first section of the webinar. It's just a model of a cinema. Okay, very simple, but it's got enough seats, it's got enough components within the model to actually have a good walkthrough around and actually show some of the simple commands. So you'll see some of the elements we've got set up here. First of all, we got this 3D sketch over here on the left hand side. You can create a 3D sketch or you can create a series of 2D sketches. Okay, it doesn't matter, you don't have to do it as a 3D sketch, but that will basically hold and constrain the user in position. The next element that we need to do is actually to start up the walkthrough animation, and to do that we go to the display manager. You'll see on here we've got walkthroughs as an option which drop down. We have to make sure we're set to view scenes, lights and cameras though, okay, because that's where we actually access them from. And if you want to go back and edit any of the existing walkthroughs you created or create any new ones, you tend to go here. So first of all, what we need to do is just right click and actually add a walkthrough. On this menu we get various options about actually starting off the walkthrough. Okay, it's very straightforward. All we need to do first of all is actually put ourselves and constrain ourselves onto one of the items in the 3D sketch. Now if I select the items one by one, you'll see they get added to the list. I would recommend though, however, actually going to your design tree and selecting the 3D sketch as one item. Okay, it then allows you to walk around the 3D sketch and constrain yourself to the whole item. I've got this option turned on to turn the avatar to follow the path, which is fairly useful. It just allows me then to walk around the path without the user actually having to turn itself. I've also orientated myself on the top plane, and you'll see this arrow, it gives an indication of the direction we're facing up. So at the moment we're facing the right direction, and we're spaced about 1650 from that top plane, which actually just positions ourselves about the height maybe of an adult male from that line as it will be, or the top plane. So all we do to actually start the walkthrough is click the Start Walkthrough button, and you'll see we just get entered into the command. Now a few things to actually get yourself in position. First of all, if we click this button here to show and hide the map, we can actually have a look at where we are relative to the rest of the design, because with larger models it's not always directly obvious. The first thing I want to do is get myself into position on the start of this 3D sketch I've created. And we could do that by physically moving the model around into position, or we can use the constraints that we've already set up, that 3D sketch. If I select it from that constraints list, and you can hide and show this panel by clicking the little button just here, I can then select the 3D sketch and then actually move myself physically back into position using the mouse, either scrolling. You can scroll the mouse backwards and forwards to the scroll wheel to move ourselves into position, or we can also use the arrow keys on the keyboard. Now in this webinar, what I'll try and do is use the commands in this menu, so you can see more physically what I'm actually clicking on to get the different sort of views and actually move myself into position. If you hover over any of these commands, you should get the kind of arrow keys and what you have to press to actually get these changes appearing. You can also orientate yourself as well as that by clicking and dragging with the left mouse key, and that will actually orientate the user around to different positions as well. Okay, as well as using that scroll wheel like I already said. Okay, you may find it easier using the keyboard as well, because it's I guess for some of you who play computer games a bit more like a kind of computer game setup. So what we need to do is to click the Set Home position, and that will just set our home position as the position we're in right now. It just means that then if we were to move forward or out of that position in any way, we can click Home and just set ourselves back to that start position. Okay, so at this point what we need to do is then just run through. I'm just going to show you some of the commands. Now you'll see as I move around at certain corners like that one there, it can give you a very sharp turn. What you do want to do is actually put fillets onto these corners, and I've just done that to illustrate. So what we'll do later on is I'll go back into the 3D sketch and we'll just edit it to put in some fillets in those areas so it's not quite so sharp. Okay, I'll just get rid of the map for a second so we can see a bit easier. Now that we're creating the walkthrough, we don't actually need it. And then we can just simply walk around. If you do want to view a different direction, you can just click this button just here to rotate the user's view into different positions, and then you click this button here to reset home, and it just resets you looking forward again. So then I'll move around up the stairs, and you'll see then I can move across and into the seat. Now, I don't know how jumpy that is for some of you watching that across the webinar, but if you do want to watch a slightly smoother version of this later on, we will have it all up on our website. What I'm going to do now is to rotate the user's view. We can obviously rotate around into position. Now, one of the things to be aware of is you might have seen there was a little line going downwards. That line is just to actually move the user so that they're actually looking like they're sitting down at the end of this section. If I just move myself to the end of that and then actually go down to that line, you see I just end up looking at the floor. Okay, so we need to, when we do the final run through, actually sort that out, and I'll show you how. So what I'll do first of all is just cancel this menu for the meantime, and I'm going to make some changes to that 3D sketch just to make it a bit smoother, a bit of an easier run through. Okay, so I'll go back to my design tree, and I'll just right click on the 3D sketch so I can make some edits. Okay, so in order to constrain it in place, I'll use some sketch fillets in here, and I'll put in some rather large sketch fillets just to get to the right dimensions. Okay, there we go. That would just smooth off the movement, and on this slightly smaller line going downwards just here, I'll put in a slightly smaller sketch fillet. So I'll accept those ones, and then I'll put in a smaller one, maybe about 400 millimeters. And that will just nicely round off that corner. Okay, so now having made changes to that 3D sketch, I'll just exit out, and then what I can do is I can go ahead and actually run through this thing for the final time. So I'll go back to my display manager, and I'll, oops, I didn't seem to have exited the sketch there. There we go. And I'll just add the walkthrough a second time, again by selecting that 3D sketch from the design tree. Okay, and if you'll notice, if you hit the tick like that, it will close down and it actually doesn't start the walkthrough. So you do have to make sure that when you're going to it, you click Edit Walkthrough, and then you click the Start Walkthrough button to actually start it rather than the tick. So I'll go to the start position. Okay, move myself back around, and then obviously because we cancelled out last time, we've got to define home again. We don't have to do it each time, but it is just useful to do that. And then this time what I'll do is I'll start recording, and then I can start moving myself around into position. Okay, the user at this point could then orientate and have a look around, potentially looking for a seat maybe, setting ourselves back to default, and then just moving around into position. Now as we get further up towards the seats, what we can do is you can just rotate the view, and if we just rotate the view around, possibly to have a look at the screen for example, and then just move forward a bit more, you'll see that then the view never actually resets itself, and it'll actually move around into that seated position quite nicely. So to create a very simple walkthrough, it's relatively straightforward, and you can just add complexity to that 3D sketch to actually get something that looks a bit better. So I'm now going to sort of play this back, and you'll see that that looks fairly good. The view selection, obviously, if you use your keyboard, you can get two things happening at once, and it actually looks a bit smoother in terms of, you know, you don't have to stop every time you look around, for example. Okay, and it'll just move around into position. You can see it then shifting itself into, have a look at the screen, and actually sitting down. Okay. So we just cancel the record screen now. Then you could generate the video from this. The available codecs you'll have are just the ones you've got installed on your machine. So if you do want to use any others, you've just got to download them. We usually recommend using the TechSmiths codec. You can download that from their website. If you just do a search for TechSmiths, you usually find that works fairly well with SolidWorks. One of the things I will show just before we go on any further, if I click the Start Walkthrough button again, one of the things we can do is actually have no constraints within this walkthrough, and you can actually just record yourself moving around just quite freely. It just allows you to move into different positions. You can move sideways, left and right, and you can also orientate the view just by clicking and dragging. Okay, so you can move around into position potentially, and then move forward. And if you do want to simulate yourself possibly looking around and then sitting down possibly, you could click the move down button this time, and that will actually allow you to move the user down into a seated position. Okay. These buttons don't normally work if you're constrained to the sketch. You've also got these commands just here which we haven't used, that just speeds up and slows down the user's movement, which just allows you to get, if you find it's a bit too quick, to get a slightly smoother path generation. Okay. So that again is quite a useful technique if you don't necessarily want to use that 3D sketch you set up, or if you haven't got a sketch actually to use in there, you can actually freely constrain yourself in there. Okay, so I won't show all of that, but like you say, you can see how we don't necessarily need to use all the commands we're looking at. All right, so I'll just cancel out of this for now. What I'm going to show now in the second part of this webinar is how to create animations using some of the other techniques using the motion study. You can create walkthroughs using motion studies as well, and it allows you for a bit more of customization when it actually comes to the final result. So I'll just open up this second example I've got here. Okay, I've got this house that I'm possibly going to run through on. And the first thing I want to do within here is actually create a number of cameras to actually use for this animation. Okay, and then I'll go about actually creating it with the motion study tab that you'll see there. So the same command toolbar we're in earlier on, the display manager, is also the place we add cameras from, and you just right click to add a camera. What we can do then is just show numeric controls to get the thing exactly in the right position. Okay, and we can target using selection points. If you have a look on the panel in the left hand side here, this is actually where we move around and actually select our target points. The view on the right is actually the view we're getting out of the camera. So I won't target it first of all. I'll move into position using Cartesian coordinates. Okay, I'll just physically put in some values there, and that will move me into the right position. Okay, and then I'm just going to move via the Z direction, and that will just move me having a look at the house from this position. Now I've just sort of memorized those figures, but you can just physically drag the cameras around the position. You'll see that it is slightly offset from the side of the house there, so I can just physically drag the item in if we do want to get it exactly in the right position, and I'll do it via -300 there. Okay, and that will just move my item in further in the house. Now to get myself in the right field of view, I can change the type of lens that I'm using. In 50mm standard, I'm going to change to a 24mm wide angle, because obviously we're looking at the house. We want something quite wide angle to get the whole thing in view. And the last thing to actually set up here is obviously the position that the camera is pointing at, the target selection. And if I just zoom in, I want something quite central on the house. I'm going to select this wall inside the house just here. That works quite well as a central point. And that just gives me a nice view to actually start the animation. So if I hit the tick, this camera is then created within the menu. We can then access it from the spacebar menu. Okay, you see it's available there. And I'm just going to rename this camera just by double clicking on it slowly. I'm going to rename it to Cartesian camera, because it's defined using Cartesian coordinates. I'll then add a second camera which we're going to define slightly differently. So you'll see in this right hand side here we've got this path that was generated in a similar way to what was created earlier on. We're going to use that within the animation. Okay, again, that's just created using 3D sketching. And what I'm going to do is to actually place myself on this path using the position by selection tool. And then we can target using selection as well. I'm just going to click on an area on the side of the house there. Okay, and again, the view is quite closed in, so I'll change my type of lens to a 24mm. And that gets me a nice view on the side of the house. You'll see that we can move as a percentage along this line to actually get the camera in the right place. And obviously, just to set myself right, I just want to make sure the rotation is set to 0. So I'll hit the tick, and that nicely creates my two cameras. I've got one called Cartesian, one called Path, which is the two ways that I've actually defined these cameras. So the second thing I'm going to do within this setup is actually create the motion study. I was just going to want to make a slight update to a change I've just made. Okay, now within here, I'm just going to set it up first of all by making sure the orientation in camera views isn't locked, because I want to be changing the orientation in camera views quite a bit. So if you right click on this top toolbar, you can disable the playback of key views, which stops any camera views being played back when you play the animation through. Or what you can do is you can disable view key creation, which actually stops any keys being created for camera view changes. So I'll turn this one off because I want to be changing the camera view all the time. What I'm going to do then is switch to my orientation Cartesian camera. Okay, and then I can start actually creating the section of this animation. So I'll just move the timeline physically to about 4 seconds, and then I can edit the camera that I'm looking through. By physically editing it in the graphics area, I can then use the triad that's placed over the item, and because it's using Cartesian coordinates, it's pointing relative to the direction of the origin. I can then drag this item to move the camera along this direction. And I'll move it to about here. I can then hit the tick. Okay, that generates a movement between 0 and 4 seconds, which will interpolate between those 2 points. So it gives me quite a nice movement. And because the display target point is set in the middle of the house still, you'll see the camera slightly rotates as it moves out into this position. I then want to put a slight second's pause at this point to allow me to just have a look at this point, as a freeze frame. So what I'm going to do is copy this key point. If I select it, hold down the control key and drag, I can simply just copy that, and I'll copy it for about half a second. Okay, you can see then it just stops, and then from this point onwards to about 7.5 seconds possibly, I can then move across the design to have a look at another section. So I edit the Cartesian camera once again. In this left hand side, I'm going to drag that triad across to have a look at the other sections of the house. And I'll move it around to about this view here. Okay. Hit the tick, and again it interpolates between that. So then add a second copy point to about 7 3/4 seconds. Okay, and then I can move up to about 10 seconds for the next key point, which will just take me to this doorway down here. You might be able to see it very slightly. And it just uses the same techniques each time. We edit the camera, and then we go ahead and drag these camera views, or physically we can just change the values on the left hand side here. Okay, obviously you may find it a bit easier to just drag the camera around because creating animations is quite a visual thing. And I'll just drag myself to this doorway just here to have a look inside the house. Again, I'll put a very slight pause in there. I'll put the second's pause this time, and then from that point on I'm going to move down this ramp you can just see here. So I've got to do 2 movements at once. So I'll move to about 13.5 seconds. Okay. Oops, I've edited the wrong camera there. Okay, you can just switch between them quite easily. And in this view, I'm just going to drag the red arrow across the design But as well as doing that, I also want to move down at the same time. So I'm also going to drag the green arrow because I need to stay relative to the position of sort of head height there. So I'll move down a slight section as well. Okay, I'll move that key point. You can move any key points anytime you want to shorten the amount of time it takes for a movement. And then for the final keyframe, up to about 15 seconds, I'll edit this camera. Oops. Okay, and I'm just going to move the item physically back to take a final shot of the house. And you'll see that all we need to do then is just drag that red arrow a little bit further, and it will just zoom out and actually get a good view of the house there. Okay, I'll copy that key point once again for about a second. Just make sure when you are copying the key points, you haven't got any others selected. It's quite easy to copy several at once. And if I just play that through from the start, we can just analyze whether it's got the right timings. We can move any key points to relevant positions. So you click play from the start, and it'll just generate and have a look through the section of the animation you created so far. And you see by putting in the slight pauses, it just gives you that bit of a stop between the different types of animation. But you see at that section, I just move straight across. So that looks quite effective already. And that is just simply by moving the camera around the model. Now the advantage of doing a walkthrough animation in this way is that we can actually switch from one camera view to another, and we can include other elements within the animation, for example lights and things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the space bar at this point, okay, and I'm going to switch to the path camera, which is the camera looking around at the section of the house, and you'll see that the camera view key point has changed there. What I can then do is put in a second's pause at this point. So I'll pause it, and then that should stop the view just for a second. Now moving round to about 17 seconds, I can just shift around the side of the house to have a look at it in a bit more detail. This time I will be editing the path camera, and all we do to actually get it in position is just physically drag this slider the percentage along the item we want to have a look at. And this time, instead of just keeping my point of focus right in the middle there, I'm actually going to be moving it around the house as we shift along. So I'll shift it to this side panel here possibly, or maybe about there, a bit more of a centralized view. Okay, you can see you can switch into any of the views by clicking in the graphics area, and it just switches what the camera is looking at. Okay, and that will just create a nice interpolation between the starting point and around to here. Okay, so that nicely just starts the animation off there. What I can do then at about 17 seconds is I can just move around to actually go up the stairs of that section. Now what I might want to do before that is actually just have a look at the side of the building. So I'll just edit the path section here. I'll just select in this area and just make sure I'm set at 17 seconds. Okay, and by moving further around in this section, you may want to select physically in the graphics area for your point of focus. I'll just focus somewhere at the top of the stairs, so I'll just rotate around and select a point around here, and then just physically move the slider further up this path. Okay, till I get to about that position. Around the side of the house then, I might want to have a look and turn around slightly as I'm going up the stairs. So again, we do the same sort of commands each time. Moving further around in position. Now you'll see as I move too far, the camera just keeps its focus point. Okay, and it doesn't quite look right. So I need to change the focus point each time as I'm doing something like walk up the stairs. This is a quite complex positional movement. Okay, now what I could do is I could just rotate around and have a look at the side of the house at this point. If I just move to about 18 seconds or 18 and a half, okay, edit the path camera, I could just change the point of focus. Looking at the side of the house, then at 19 actually looking back down again. Okay. Now sometimes when you do take a shot like this, it is nice to actually get a second's pause. So you could actually just copy that key point for a second, and you see that gives you quite a nice movement around the stairs there. So as you move around, stops at this point, looks up at the side of the house, okay, and then we can look back down again. Okay, and all we just have to do is just click in the graphics area where we want to look from this point. Okay, and then we can just simply move up the stairs to get ourselves in the right position. You see it's quite a simple movement. So I move up to this position and you'll see that it starts to look down there. So you could actually stop the key point there, start to look around at something else as you go up to the last keyframe, taking yourself around to maybe have a look at the side of the house, for example. So having a look at something like that then keeps the view focus high. I'll then move to 50 seconds. Okay, you'll see that's not maybe something like that kind of view, or looking inside the house possibly. And if we play that section through from about here, we should see the kind of movement we've got there quite nice. So it plays off from this part at the start, it goes up the stairs and actually looks up, and then moves around up the stairs and has a look through the window. You might then want to put in a second's pause at this point. And then we can just have a look at some of the other elements within the house. So rotating the view around to have a look at possibly just the side of the building, for example. Okay. And again, each section that you move around to, just take a second's pause just to make sure that it does look like a planned thing. It doesn't just look like you're rotating the camera sort of madly round into different positions. Okay, so like at this example here, we just take a second's pause to make sure that looks like it's sort of a planned position. Okay, move back to a sort of start point, looking actually this time changing the view from the parts of the model actually to the spline that we created. And you do just have to hover around it for a second, and then you actually just get the percentage along the spline as a focus point as well. And if I put that to 55, I'm 5% further along the spline by focusing than I am by actually position. And that just actually sets me up for the next part of the animation. Okay, so at this point I'll take a slight pause, and then I'll actually start moving through the house. So I'm going to scroll myself along to about 31 seconds, possibly 32, give myself a bit more time. And I'll just make sure that this is always 5% further ahead than this. So, for example, I could move the view through the house to about 95 and move the camera around to a further position. And you'll see that then we get a view at the side of the house there. Okay? And that just interpolates between those 2 points. So that then should give us the full animation. So if I play that back and play it from the start, we get quite an effective walkthrough actually by using cameras and integrating other parts into the animation. Now, one of the things you can do with animations like this is you can actually set up other things as well as just the standard cameras moving around. You can actually have lights going on and off, for example. Now, don't worry about things like the sketch that's shown there. All we'd need to do is actually hide that out of the way, and the animation would look a lot cleaner. Okay, so if we got rid of that, you'd see the animation would look okay. But other elements like that would then go ahead and actually save the animation to use the same kind of settings we were talking about earlier on. So using those kind of codecs, the TextSmith one possibly. So now that we've gone through this whole section, you can change any of these key points that you created by simply dragging them around to change the timings. And we can adjust any of them by selecting different positions, changing what we've put in, and clicking the update key button on different items you've got selected. So it's very easy to actually set up the animations and get them exactly right how you want them. Okay. Now that I've been through all that section, the last thing I want to show is actually a light just turning on as we come to this doorway. So you'll see that I have already got a spotlight available here, and we can just say on in SolidWorks at this second. Okay. Then what it does is it takes interpolation from the start of the animation up to 10 seconds, and it will turn the animation light on at that point. I'll just drag this so it starts coming on here. And then I want it to come on, instead of fading on, you'll see at the moment it's fading, we want it to turn on all of a sudden. So we change the interpolation mode, which is how the movement is actually changing from one point to another. And you can see the little graphs there give you a good idea of what they're doing. So what I'm going to do is do snap, and that will do so the change comes all of a sudden. Okay, the light will come on, and then the user will start moving along. If I just move that key point a bit further in, okay, there's the section of the animation that we want to have a look at. So you can see at that point then the light comes on, and then the user will move around and have a look at some other elements of the house. Okay, so it works quite well within the animation to have that sort of going on. All right. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of some of the things you can achieve when using animations in conjunction with walkthroughs, and actually using things like the path as well as some of the other elements like lighting to actually get quite good looking walkthroughs and switching between cameras. Okay. Thanks very much for watching. Now, before I actually go, I just wanted to point out actually some of the future webinars we've got coming up. You'll see we've got one on the 11th of April on SolidWorks Explorer, one on the 18th on Bearing Calculator, and then one on Cams and Grooves. Okay, thanks very much.